The morning Lavinia Kendrick walked into the Calhoun County Courthouse for the third time in 2 years. She wore the same black dress she had buried her husband in, because it was the finest thing she owned, and she refused to let Harlan Briggs and his bank think for even one moment that she was beaten. The dress was a deep charcoal wool, fitted at the waist and worn thin at the elbows, and she had pressed it the night before with a flat iron heated on the stove until every crease was sharp enough to cut glass. She had pinned her dark brown hair up tight at the back of her neck the way she always did when she needed to feel armored, and she had polished her boots with the last of the tin of black wax she kept on the shelf above the wash basin. She looked at herself in the small oval mirror above that wash basin and said, out loud, to no one but herself and the empty kitchen of the house she was fighting to keep, "You are going to walk in there and you are going to win." She had said the same thing before the first hearing, in the spring of 1881, 3 months after Thomas Kendrick had died of a fever that took him in less than a week, leaving her with 240 acres outside of Redemption, Texas, a half-built barn, a herd of 40 cattle, and a loan note with the First Territorial Bank of Calhoun County that Harlan Briggs was now claiming was due in full. She had said it before the second hearing too, in the autumn of that same year, after Briggs had produced a second document she had never seen before, a revised contract bearing what was supposedly Thomas's signature, extending the terms of repayment into an accelerated schedule that would have required her to hand over 3/4 of the cattle and deed over the southern 40 acres outright. The circuit judge at that hearing, a red-faced man named Aldous Pruitt who smelled of tobacco and whiskey before noon, had looked at the document, looked at her, and said he needed more time to review the matter. More time. That was 18 months ago. Now it was March of 1883, and Lavinia was 31 years old, and she had spent the last 2 years running the Kendrick Ranch with her own 2 hands, and the help of a 62-year-old ranch hand named Clem Ford who had bad knees and a worse back, but refused to leave because he had worked for Thomas's father before Thomas, and said he would die on that land before he let a bank take it. She had also relied on her neighbor, a Mexican woman named Esperanza Vila, who ran the 50 acres to the north with her 2 teenage sons, and who had become Lavinia's closest friend in the world during those 2 years of fighting. Together, Lavinia and Clem and Esperanza had kept the herd alive through a brutal dry summer and 2 hard winters. They had sold cattle at fair prices and saved every dollar they could, and Lavinia had hired a lawyer from San Antonio named Orrin Whitfield who charged her $20 a month and communicated mostly by telegraph, and had, in her opinion, done approximately $20 worth of good in the entire 2 years. Orrin Whitfield had written her a letter 2 weeks before the third hearing. The letter said that he had reviewed the second document, the revised contract, and that while he believed it to be fraudulent, he could not prove it without a document examiner, and that such an examiner would cost $150, which was money Lavinia did not have. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had received a telegram from someone in Redemption asking questions about the case on her behalf, someone named Noah Hunter, and did she know this person? She had written back immediately, "No, I do not know a Noah Hunter. Who is he?" Whitfield's reply came 4 days later, a lawyer apparently, from out of Colorado. "He appeared at my office in San Antonio asking about your case. Seemed sharp. Claims he passed through Redemption last month and heard about your situation. Says he wants to help. I told him the hearing was March 14th. I leave it to your discretion whether to allow it." Lavinia had read that letter 3 times sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and then she had folded it, put it in the drawer with all the other letters from Whitfield, and thought about it for 4 days before she wrote back, "Let him come if he wants to. I am not in a position to turn away help." That had been the extent of her preparation for Noah Hunter, and now it was the morning of March 14th, 1883, and she was standing in the yard in the cold blue dawn light, hitching her roan mare to the wagon, and she had not yet seen or heard from this man and was fully prepared to walk into that courthouse exactly as she had the previous 2 times, alone. Clem came out of the bunkhouse pulling his coat on and said, "You want company." It was not a question. He said it the way he said most things, like it was already decided and he was just informing her of the fact. "You stay with the cattle," she said, checking the harness buckle. "I need someone here." "Those cattle will be fine for one day, Mrs. Kendrick." "Clem." She looked at him over the mare's back. "Please." He looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, and then he nodded slowly. "You come back with good news." "That's the plan," she said, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. The town of Redemption was 12 miles east of the ranch, and in March the road was a muddy, rutted thing that rattled her teeth and tested the mare's patience. Lavinia drove the wagon with both hands on the reins, her eyes on the road, her mind running through everything she knew about the case the way she had done 1,000 times before. The original loan note, the dates, Thomas's handwriting on the original, the discrepancies in the revised document that she had spotted herself, that Whitfield had confirmed but could not prove without paying someone to confirm them. The fact that Harlan Briggs had purchased 3 other properties in the county in the last 2 years under circumstances that felt, to her gut at least, distinctly suspicious. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did when she was driving to Redemption. He had been a quiet man, Thomas, a good man, steady and sure as a fence post and twice as dependable. He had loved this land with a devotion that she had found almost religious to witness. He had talked about what it would look like in 20 years, the barn finished and painted red, more cattle, maybe horses, a vegetable garden that Lavinia would actually have time to tend properly. He had been 43 years old when the fever took him, and he had not been afraid, which she found both comforting and unbearable in equal measure. She was not going to lose his land. She had decided that the day she buried him, and 2 years of fighting had not changed her mind, and neither would today. The town of Redemption announced itself first as a smear of wood smoke against the pale morning sky, then as the sound of hammering from the new building going up on the south end of Main Street, then as the smell of horse and dust, and the particular iron-edged cold of a Texas March morning in the open valley where the town sat. Lavinia drove down Main Street with her chin level and her eyes forward, and the people she passed, some of whom she had known for years, either waved or looked away depending on which side of things they stood on. Harlan Briggs was not a man who was easy to be against in Calhoun County. He had fingers in more pies than a man with only 10 fingers ought to, and people knew it, and most of them had decided that knowing it was enough, and that doing anything about it was someone else's problem. She tied the mare at the post outside the courthouse and was smoothing her skirt when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, a deliberate, unhurried sound, and turned. The man walking toward her was not from Redemption. She knew that the way she knew most things, immediately and without much need for explanation. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet or just over, with the kind of lean build that came from years of hard living rather than any particular vanity about it. He wore a dark gray coat over a plain white shirt and a dark vest, clean but not fancy, and his boots were good leather, well kept. He had a hat pushed back slightly on his head, a dark brown hat with a straight brim that had seen some weather. His hair beneath it was dark too, cut short and neat. He was perhaps 35 or 6, with a face that was angular and watchful, the kind of face that did not give things away easily. He was carrying a leather satchel, the kind lawyers carried. He stopped 3 feet from her and said, "Mrs. Kendrick." "That depends," she said, "on who's asking." The corner of his mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Noah Hunter." "I wrote to your lawyer in San Antonio." She looked at him steadily. Up close his eyes were a dark gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were looking at her with a directness that she found both frank and oddly respectful, as though he was seeing her clearly and had decided she merited the effort of looking clearly. "Mr. Whitfield mentioned you," she said. "He said you were a lawyer from Colorado." "From Denver, originally. I've been working cases through Texas and New Mexico for the past year. What kind of cases? Land cases mostly, banks overreaching their authority, fraudulent contract disputes. He paused. The kind of thing that appears to be happening to you. Lavinia studied him for another moment. There was nothing in his manner that suggested performance or flattery, which was the thing she distrusted most in people. He was simply standing in front of her, in the cold March morning, telling her what he was. "What do you know about my case?" she asked. "I know about the original loan note taken out by your husband Thomas Kendrick in 1879, with the First Territorial Bank at 6% annual interest over a 10-year repayment period. I know about the second document that Briggs produced in October 1881, claiming it supersedes the original terms. I know about the 2 previous hearings and the fact that Judge Pruitt has been sitting on a ruling for 18 months. He paused again. "And I know that the second document is a forgery." The word landed between them in the cold air like a stone dropping into still water. "How do you know that?" she asked, very quietly. "Because I found a man in Austin who is one of the best document examiners in the state of Texas, and I brought his written analysis with me." He patted the satchel. He spent 3 weeks looking at both documents. The ink on Thomas Kendrick's signature in the second document was applied at a different point in time than the rest of the text, and the composition of the ink itself is different. The signature was transferred, traced most likely from the original. Your husband never signed that second document, Mrs. Kendrick. He never saw it. Lavinia felt something shift in her chest, something that had been wound tight for 2 years. Not relief exactly. Not yet. But the possibility of it, the shape of it, which was different from what she had been carrying. She said, "How much did this cost you?" "That is not your concern right now, Mr. Hunter." Her voice was firm. "I am not in the habit of accepting charity I cannot account for." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted slightly, a kind of recognition, as though she had said something that confirmed a thing he had already suspected about her. "Then consider it a professional investment," he said. "I take a percentage of successful outcomes in land cases. If we win today, and I believe we will, I will take 5% of the value of the property that is secured. If we don't win, you owe me nothing. What percentage of cases do you lose?" "I haven't lost one yet," he said. "But I will be honest with you, I have not faced a situation quite this entrenched. Briggs has influence in this county. That is a factor. It means we need to be better prepared than just better. We need to be undeniable." "Are we undeniable?" He looked at her, and this time the beginning of a smile reached his eyes. "I think so. Yes." She looked at him for a beat longer, and then she turned and walked toward the courthouse door. "Then let us go be undeniable," she said. He fell into step beside her. The courthouse in Redemption was a 2-story building of pale yellow limestone that had been built in 1875 and already looked older than that, its trim paint peeling and its front steps worn concave from a decade of boot heels. Inside, the main hearing room smelled of sawdust and old paper, and the particular institutional cold that courthouses always seem to preserve regardless of the season outside. There were perhaps 20 people in the room when Lavinia and Noah walked in together. She recognized most of them. 3 ranchers who had been watching the case with interest because what happened to her would tell them something about what might happen to them. 2 women from town, the wife of the land registrar and the wife of the feed store owner, who had been unfailingly kind to Lavinia and had told her privately that they thought Briggs was a criminal, but that their husbands would not say so publicly. Esperanza Vila, sitting near the back in her good shawl, who caught Lavinia's eye and gave her a small, fierce nod. Harlan Briggs was already at the long table on the right side of the room, and he was not alone. He had 2 lawyers with him, men imported from Fort Worth who wore suits that cost more than most of the ranchers in the room made in a year. He was a heavy man, Briggs, thick in the neck and the shoulders, with a wide flat face that had settled into a permanent expression of satisfaction with itself. He was perhaps 50, with silver streaking his dark hair, and he wore it the way he wore everything, as though it were simply another indicator of his position. He glanced at Lavinia when she entered, then at Noah, and his expression changed almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes. Lavinia sat down at the left table, and Noah set his satchel on the table beside her and opened it with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what order he wanted things in. Orrin Whitfield slipped into the room just before the judge appeared, looking harried and apologetic in the way he always did, as though the world was consistently surprising him with demands he had not anticipated. He shook Noah's hand and they exchanged a few words in low voices that Lavinia did not hear, and then Whitfield sat down and arranged his own papers and said to Lavinia out of the corner of his mouth, "He told me about the document examiner. That is remarkable work." "Is it enough?" she said. Whitfield hesitated a half-second too long. "It will be," Noah said on her other side without looking up from his papers. Judge Aldous Pruitt entered from the side door and settled himself into his chair with the ceremony of a man who took seriously his own sense of importance. He was the same judge who had presided over the second hearing. Lavinia had spent 18 months reading his face in her memory and had concluded that he was not, at his core, a dishonest man. He was simply a cautious one, which in her experience was almost as damaging in a situation like hers, because cautious men tended to defer to power rather than challenge it. "This is the continuation of the matter of Kendrick versus the First Territorial Bank of Calhoun County," Pruitt said, settling his glasses on his nose and looking at his papers. "We are here to resolve the question of the loan obligations and the validity of the contract presented by the bank in October 1881. He looked up. "I see new representation for the plaintiff." Noah rose. "Noah Hunter, Your Honor, admitted to the bar in Colorado in 1875 and in Texas in 1878. I am appearing on behalf of Mrs. Lavinia Kendrick." Pruitt looked at him for a moment over his glasses. "Mr. Hunter, you are taking over from Mr. Whitfield." "Assisting Mr. Whitfield, Your Honor. We have new evidence we would like to present." Pruitt's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted in the way that told Lavinia he had registered the satchel and was curious despite himself. New evidence. At this stage. New evidence that materially bears on the validity of the contract in question, Your Honor. Evidence that was not available at the time of the previous hearing. Briggs's senior lawyer, a thin man named Carver, was already on his feet. "Your Honor, I object to any new—" "You'll have your turn, Mr. Carver," Pruitt said, with a mildness that nonetheless shut the objection down. He looked at Noah again. "Proceed, Mr. Hunter." What happened in the next 45 minutes was something that Lavinia would replay in her memory many times in the years afterward, the way you replay things that changed the shape of your life so that you can be sure they actually happened. Noah presented the document examiner's analysis with a precision and a clarity that made everything Orrin Whitfield had done in the previous 2 years look like it had been done in the dark. He walked the judge through the findings point by point, explaining in plain language what the examiner had found and what it meant, and he did it in a way that acknowledged Pruitt's intelligence without condescending to it. He had brought the original documents and the examiner's annotated copies, and he placed them before the judge in the right order at the right moment, and he answered every question Pruitt asked without hesitation and without flourish. When Carver objected, Noah met every objection with a counter that was so well prepared, it was clear he had anticipated each one. When Briggs himself leaned over to whisper something to Carver, Noah watched them with an attentiveness that was not threatening but was absolutely present, and Lavinia could see that Briggs found this unsettling in a way he had not expected. But the thing that Lavinia remembered most clearly, the thing that she would tell people about later when she described that day, was the moment when Noah turned from the judge and looked directly at the room, not performing for the audience, not making a speech, just speaking with a plain directness that filled the space. "Mrs. Kendrick came to this court 2 years ago with evidence of her husband's original agreement and the means to honor it, he said. She has honored it, every payment on time, despite circumstances that would have broken most people. She has worked that land and maintained that herd and kept that property in better condition than when the loan was made, which means the bank's investment is, if anything, more secure now than it was when Thomas Kendrick was alive. What she has been fighting is not a legitimate financial obligation. She has been fighting a forgery, and I am asking this court today to say so. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Pruitt took off his glasses and rubbed them on his coat front and put them back on. Then he looked at the documents again. Then he looked at Harlan Briggs. Briggs met the look with the bland confidence of a man who had always believed that having power was the same thing as being right. Pruitt looked back at the documents. "I am going to take a short recess to review this analysis," he said. "Court will reconvene in 1 hour." The room exhaled. Lavinia sat very still. Noah turned to her and said in a low voice, "He is going to rule in your favor." "How do you know?" "Because he is an honest man who just had an honest reason handed to him," Noah said. "He has been waiting for one. That is why he has been sitting on this for 18 months rather than ruling against you. He did not believe the second document, but he did not have the tools to say so." He paused. "Now he does." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment. "You are either very good or very confident." "Ideally both," he said. And this time the smile reached his whole face, and it transformed it entirely, turning the watchful, contained expression into something unexpectedly warm. And Lavinia felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt in 2 years and was not entirely prepared for. She looked away and folded her hands on the table. During the recess, Esperanza appeared at her shoulder and squeezed her arm without saying anything, which said everything. Orrin Whitfield pumped Noah's hand and said several things that amounted to being deeply impressed, while trying not to appear too self-conscious about it. The 2 women from town stopped Lavinia near the door and told her they were praying for her. And Noah stood slightly apart from all of this, looking over his papers one more time, and Lavinia watched him from across the room without quite meaning to, and noticed the way he held himself, contained and self-sufficient, a man who was clearly accustomed to standing slightly apart. She wondered briefly what had brought him from Denver to the back roads of Texas asking questions about the case of a widow he had never met. She would ask him, she decided. Later, when Pruitt returned and court reconvened and he read his ruling, the language was formal and measured in the way that legal language always was, but the substance of it was unambiguous. The second document was determined to be of questionable authenticity. The original loan note was reinstated as the binding agreement. Mrs. Lavinia Kendrick was to be permitted to continue her existing payment schedule without penalty or acceleration, and any claims made by the bank on the basis of the second document were dismissed. He did not use the word forgery. Legally, that would require a separate criminal proceeding, which Pruitt noted pointedly was a matter for the county sheriff and the district court. He looked at Briggs when he said it. Briggs looked back with the same bland expression, but the set of his jaw had changed. The room reacted with the particular suppressed energy of people who had been watching something for a long time and were not quite sure it was over yet. A low murmur, a few people turning to each other, someone near the back making a sound that was not quite a cheer but was close to one. Lavinia sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed. Noah leaned toward her and said, very quietly, "You won." She turned to look at him. His eyes were on her, that direct sage-colored gaze, and there was something in it that was more than professional satisfaction. There was something that was personal, some investment in this outcome that went beyond what he had explained in front of the courthouse that morning. "We won," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded once in a way that acknowledged the correction. Outside the courthouse afterward in the sharp March sunlight, the world looked different to Lavinia in a way she could not entirely articulate. The street was the same street, the mud the same mud, the cold the same cold. But the weight she had been carrying was different. Not gone, not entirely, but redistributed like a load that had been rebalanced so that it no longer threatened to topple her. Esperanza hugged her hard and said, in the mix of English and Spanish that was their ordinary language together, that she had always known, and that Thomas would have been so proud. Lavinia held on to her friend for a moment and felt the thing that she had been holding back for 2 years press briefly at the back of her eyes, and then she breathed through it and it passed. Whitfield was speaking with Noah a few feet away, and Lavinia disengaged from Esperanza and walked over to them. Whitfield said his goodbyes with the harried efficiency that marked all his transitions, shaking her hand firmly and telling her to write if anything further developed, and then he was gone, climbing up into the livery buggy he had hired. Lavinia looked at Noah. He had put the documents back in his satchel and was standing with his coat collar turned up against the wind. "Mr. Hunter," she said, "I have a long drive back to my ranch, but before I go, I would very much like to buy you a cup of coffee. Or a meal if you have not eaten, and I want to ask you some things." He looked at her for a moment, and that brief warmth came back into his expression. "I would like that," he said. The only respectable place in Redemption to have a conversation over food was Me Calloway's, which occupied the ground floor of the Redemption Hotel on the corner of Main and 2nd Street. Me Calloway was a stout, red-haired woman of 50 who ran her establishment with the iron authority of someone who had decided long ago exactly what standard she was operating to and was not interested in debating the subject. She made a good beef stew and better biscuits, and her coffee was strong enough to stand up to the March cold. Lavinia and Noah took a table near the window, and Me brought coffee without being asked, which was her way of indicating approval of the company. And then Lavinia looked across the table at the man who had walked into her hearing that morning and changed everything. "Tell me the truth," she said. "How did you hear about my case?" Noah wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, which was a gesture that made him seem suddenly less formal, more human, and said, "I was passing through Redemption in January. I stopped at the livery to rest my horse, and the man who runs it, an old man, Jefferson Pike," Lavinia said. "That's right." He was not a man who talked much, but once he started talking about the Kendrick situation, he did not stop. "He told me about the hearing, about the forged document, about the fact that you had been fighting alone for 2 years. Noah paused. "He said you were the bravest woman in Calhoun County, and that it was a shame no one with actual legal knowledge had stepped in to help." Lavinia thought of old Jefferson Pike with his tobacco-stained mustache and his unerring instinct for what was right. "He said that." "He did. And then he showed me a copy of the original loan document that you had filed with the land registry. He had gotten it from the clerk because he was curious about the case. I looked at it for about 30 seconds and I knew something was wrong with what Briggs was claiming. So you went to San Antonio and found a document examiner," Lavinia said. "I went to Austin first, then San Antonio. I spent about 3 weeks on this before I contacted your lawyer." Lavinia was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "You spent 3 weeks working on a case for a woman you had never met, on the word of a livery man." "It was more than that," Noah said. He looked out the window for a moment, at the muddy street, at the people moving along the boardwalk in the cold morning. "I have been working land cases for 6 years. Before that, I was part of a firm in Denver that handled mostly mining claims. And the thing I have learned, the thing I know for certain, is that the people who have the least resource and the most at stake are almost always the people who are least served by the legal system that is supposed to serve them. Banks and men like Briggs understand how to use the machinery of the law as a weapon. Most ordinary people, most women especially, do not have the tools to fight that. It is a systemic injustice that I find," he stopped briefly, "genuinely intolerable." He said the last 2 words quietly, without drama, and she believed them entirely. "And you just travel around fixing it," she said. He looked at her and the warmth came back into his expression. "I try to." She took a sip of her coffee and put the cup down and said, "Thomas would have liked you very much. It came out more simply than she had intended, more directly, and she saw something in his eyes shift at the mention of Thomas's name, a careful attention. What was he like? Noah asked. It was not the question she had expected. Most people, when they learned she was a widow, either avoided the subject of her husband entirely or offered condolences in a way that closed the door on him rather than opening it. Noah asked it like a man who actually wanted to know. So she told him. She told him about Thomas's quietness and his steadiness, about the way he had loved the land, about his plans for the barn and the cattle and the 20-year vision. She told him about the fever, which had been fast and ruthless, and had left no time for anything except being there. She told him about the morning after the funeral when she had walked out to the fence line at the east edge of the property and looked out over the winter grass and made her decision. Noah listened without interrupting, with the attentiveness of a man who understood that this was important, that she was not simply filling silence but doing something necessary. When she finished, he said, "You have kept every one of his payments." "Every one," she said. "On time, I would not have missed one. That matters to the record and to the outcome today." He paused. "But you know that. You knew it mattered. That is why you kept them." "Yes," she said. They sat with their coffee for a while, and the conversation moved into other territory, easier territory, the kind of conversation that happens when two careful people discover that they might actually trust each other. She asked about Denver, and he told her about it with the perspective of a man who had left it and was clear-eyed about the reasons. She asked about the other land cases he had worked, and he described 2 of them in enough detail to be interesting, and with enough discretion to make her understand that there were clients whose stories he protected. She liked him, she realized, which was a simple thing but also not a simple thing, because she was a woman who did not spend her social capital freely. He asked her about the ranch, about the cattle, about the practical mechanics of how she had managed the operation alone, and she answered honestly, including the parts that had been hard, which were all of the parts, and he asked good questions. He was not a man who romanticized the reality of ranch life or condescended to it. The coffee had gone cold and me had refilled it twice when Noah looked at the time on his pocket watch and said, "You have a long drive. You should not start back too late." "You are right," she said. She stood up and looked at him. "What are your plans, Mr. Hunter, after this?" He looked slightly surprised by the question, as though he had not quite gotten to that part yet. "I have a few other matters to settle in the county. There is a property dispute in Harmon that I am looking into. I expect to be in the area for a few more weeks." "Well," she said, and then stopped, not quite sure what she intended to say. He looked at her. "The Kendrick Ranch has a standing policy of hospitality," she said, keeping her voice even. "If you are passing through the area and need a meal or a place to rest your horse, that is all I am saying." She said it the way she said most things, directly and without apology, and waited. He looked at her for a moment, and the warmth in his eyes was warm now, clearly and without ambiguity. "I will keep that in mind," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Kendrick." "Lavinia," she said. She was not quite sure why she said it, or rather she was quite sure, but was not yet prepared to examine that certainty too closely. Something shifted in his expression. "Lavinia," he said, and her name in his voice was a different thing than it had been in anyone else's voice for a long time. She left redemption with her heart in a state she had not expected when she had driven into town that morning, and she drove the 12 miles home through the cold afternoon with the weight redistributed and the horizon looking wider than it had in 2 years. Clem was waiting at the fence when she drove up, and when she climbed down from the wagon and looked at him, he said, "Well." "We won," she said. He took his hat off and looked at the sky. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Thomas would have been glad." "Yes," she said. "He would." That night she sat at the kitchen table after supper with a lamp burning, and wrote a letter to Esperanza and another one shorter, to Orrin Whitfield, thanking him for his work over the years, and telling him she hoped to not need his services again in the near future. She did not write a letter to Noah Hunter, because she had not given him the ranch's address, and he had not asked for it. which she decided to regard as an open question rather than a closed one. She blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark thinking about the ranch, about the next season, about the cattle, about the barn that still needed the south wall finished, about the fact that she had actually won, about the way Noah Hunter had said her name. She slept better than she had in 2 years. He came 2 weeks later. She was mending a section of fence at the north edge of the property, the one that backed up against Esperanza's land, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up and saw him coming along the track from the east. He was riding a big bay horse that moved with the easy, ground-covering stride of a well-bred animal, and he had traded his courthouse coat for a worn leather jacket, and without the formal setting he looked more at ease, more himself. The hat pushed back the same way it had been that morning outside the courthouse, but the expression beneath it relaxed. He saw her and turned off the road and rode across the field toward her, and she kept working on the fence because there was no sense in making a production of it, and he rode up and swung down and said, "Good afternoon." "Mr. Hunter," she said, without looking up from the wire she was twisting. "Noah," he said, which she thought was fair. "Noah," she agreed. He tied his horse to the fence post and looked at the section she was working on. "What broke it?" "Cattle," she said. "The big red one." He thinks the fence is a suggestion rather than an instruction. Noah looked amused. "Can I help? Do you know how to mend fence?" "I grew up on a ranch in Wyoming," he said, "before law school." She handed him the wire without comment, and he took it and worked on it alongside her, and they were quiet for a while with only the wind in the grass and the sound of work between them, which she found more comfortable than most people's conversation. After a while he said, "The Harmon case is more straightforward than yours was. I think it will resolve within the week." "Good," she said. "And then, how did it go with Briggs after the ruling?" Noah was quiet for a moment, working the wire through the post. Judge Prewitt sent a letter to the county sheriff, recommending an investigation into the provenance of the second document. Briggs's lawyers are, I am told, already negotiating the terms of that quietly. He will not go to prison. Men like Briggs rarely do, but the investigation will make it considerably more difficult for him to do what he did to you to anyone else in this county. Lavinia considered this. It was not entirely satisfying, but it was real. The other properties he bought, 2 of them are already the subject of complaints that the sheriff is now looking into, whether he wants to or not. Noah glanced at her. "It does not undo what was done, but it stops more being done." "It is something," she said. "It is." They finished the fence section, and she made coffee at the outdoor fire she kept for working days, and they drank it sitting on the top rail of the adjacent fence like 2 people who had known each other longer than they had. And he told her about Wyoming, and she told him about Virginia, where she had grown up before coming west with Thomas. She had grown up in the Shenandoah Valley, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a man who worked at the mill, and she had left at 22 with Thomas, who had been a friend of her older brother's and had asked her father's permission, and then her own in that order, which she had appreciated. They had come to Texas when Thomas's uncle died and left him the land, and she had fallen in love with the landscape of it despite herself, the wide flat sky and the grass that went to the horizon, and the particular quality of the Texas light in the late afternoon that turned everything gold and copper. She was telling him this, the thing about the light, when she caught herself and stopped and looked at him, and found him looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something softer and more direct at the same time, and she felt the thing in her chest again that she was no longer pretending she did not feel. "What brought you to law?" she asked, redirecting. He accepted the redirection without comment, which told her he had noticed the shift and was giving her room for it. "My father lost his ranch when I was 12, he said. "Mining company found silver under the North Quarter. They did not ask. They found a lawyer who found an obscure provision in the territorial land grant, and they applied it, and we were gone in 6 weeks. He paused. "I decided I wanted to understand how that worked, so that I could stop it happening to other people." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. "You were 12 when you decided that." "I was 12 when it happened," he said. I was about 18 when I decided what to do about it. She looked at him. He was looking out at the horizon, the same way she looked at it when she was thinking about something she carried. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she understood this man in the way you understood people who had been shaped by loss in a direction rather than out of one. After that first visit, he came back several more times over the following weeks, always with a reason that was real enough. A question about the land registry records. A document he wanted her to look at related to the Harmon case. But the reasons were never really the reasons, or not only the reasons, and they both knew it and neither of them said so directly for a while, which was its own kind of language. Clem watched all of this with the expression of a man who was not going to say anything but was keeping track, and Esperanza, who came over on a Thursday in late March and met Noah when he happened to be at the ranch, was considerably less circumspect. "He is a good man," Esperanza said to Lavinia afterward in the kitchen, with the directness that Lavinia had always loved about her. "I know," Lavinia said. "So you like him," Esperanza said. It was not a question. It was Esperanza's version of Clem's way of speaking, declarative and already decided. "I am," Lavinia said carefully, "aware of him." Esperanza laughed, a warm, bright sound that filled the kitchen. "That is the most Lavinia Kendrick way to say yes that I have ever heard." Lavinia found herself smiling despite herself, which was a thing she was doing more frequently in those weeks, the smiling. She noticed it the way you noticed an old coat that had been put away and then found again, familiar and better than remembered. The Harmon case resolved as Noah had predicted, and he told her about it on a Tuesday evening in April when he appeared at the ranch at supper time, and she asked him to stay, straightforwardly, because there was enough stew and there was no good reason not to. Clem joined them at the table and talked about Wyoming, which apparently neither man had expected but both found welcome. And the evening was easy in the way that evenings are when the people in them have stopped working at being something for each other and started just being it. After Clem had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, Noah stayed at the kitchen table with his coffee and Lavinia sat across from him, and the lamp burned between them, and after a while he said, "I have been offered a position in San Antonio, a land law practice that specializes in this kind of case, systemic statewide." She looked at him. "Are you taking it?" "I am considering it," he said. "San Antonio is not far from here." He looked at her when he said it. She met his look. "It is not," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "I do not want to be the kind of man who says something before he has the right to say it." "What right is it that you think you need?" she asked. He looked at her and the lamplight was warm on his face and he said, "The right that comes from you knowing who I am, not just today in the courthouse, all of it." She thought about that. It was such a specific thing to say, and so precisely the right thing that she felt it land squarely in the center of the thing she had been feeling for weeks. "Then tell me who you are," she said. He told her. He told her about Wyoming and his father and the mining company, which she had heard. But he told her more now. The texture of it, the year they had spent in a two-room house in Cheyenne while his father found other work. The way his mother had kept the family's dignity intact through sheer force of will. He told her about the scholarship to the University of Denver and the law professor there, who had taken a specific interest in land rights cases, and who had shaped Noah's understanding of the law as something that should be a tool for the least powerful rather than the most. He told her about the early years of practice, the cases won and lost, the case in New Mexico 2 years ago where he had failed a family he still thought about, the details of which he did not share but the weight of which was clear. He told her about traveling alone, about the way he moved from place to place, and the particular freedom and the particular cost of that, about the fact that at 36 years old he had not stayed anywhere long enough to build the thing he actually wanted to build. She listened to all of it with the same attentiveness she had given him that morning outside the courthouse when she had decided in about 30 seconds that he was someone who meant what he said. When he had finished, she said, "I have not spoken to anyone the way I have spoken to you since Thomas died." He was very still for a moment. "I do not say that to pressure you," she added. "I say it because you asked to be known, and that is part of knowing me." "I know," he said quietly. "I know that is not what it is. I have this ranch," she said. "I have fought 2 years for it, and I intend to stay on it for the rest of my life. That is not going to change." "I would never ask it to," he said. "San Antonio is manageable," she said. "It is," he said. They looked at each other across the lamplight for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not tentatively, but with the same directness he brought to everything, a clear statement rather than a question. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning and the night outside, and it was not dramatic and it was not theatrical. But it was the most certain she had felt about anything since the morning she had buried Thomas and decided to fight for the land he had loved. Noah came to the ranch as often as he could manage through April and May, making the ride from Redemption, where he kept a room at the hotel when he was working in the county, and sometimes staying for a few days when cases required him to be in the area. He helped Clem finish the south wall of the barn, which was a project that had been hovering unfinished for more than a year, and Clem accepted this help with his characteristic mixture of practical approval and careful observation. Lavinia watched the two men work on the barn one afternoon from the kitchen window while she was making bread, and felt something settle in her that she had not realized was still restless. Not that Noah replaced anything. That was not how it worked, and she was clear-eyed about that. He was his own thing, entirely separate from what Thomas had been and what that loss had been. But the restlessness had been not just grief, but also the 2 years of fighting alone, the 2 years of being the only person standing between the ranch and disaster, and she had not fully understood how exhausting that had been until it began to ease. Esperanza met Noah properly for the first time at the end of April, when Lavinia invited her and her sons to supper. And after supper, Esperanza found occasion to speak with Noah privately in the way that Esperanza found occasion to do exactly what she wanted to do when she wanted to do it. Lavinia watched them talking by the porch steps and was not at all surprised when Esperanza came back inside with an expression that said she approved, and said to Lavinia in a tone that brooked no argument, "He is an honest man." "Yes," Lavinia said. "You should keep him," Esperanza said. "I am working on it," Lavinia said, which made Esperanza laugh again. In May, Noah told her he had officially taken the position in San Antonio, which would begin in the autumn, and that until then he intended to remain in Calhoun County. He said it with a clarity that told her he had made the decision primarily so that he would have a reason to be near her, and she did not pretend to think otherwise. On a warm evening in late May, they were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become their ordinary pattern on evenings when he was there. The two of them on the porch steps with coffee or sometimes lemonade when the evenings were warm enough, talking or not talking with equal ease, watching the light go gold and copper over the west pasture in the way she had tried to describe to him months ago. He said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not in a hurry and not without you understanding what I mean by it." She set her cup down and turned toward him on the step. The evening light was warm on his face, and she could see in the set of his jaw the particular combination of certainty and nerves that she found endearing in a man who was not generally given to nerves about anything. "Then ask me properly," she said. He looked at her with that direct, clear look, the one she had first seen outside the courthouse and had been thinking about in some form or another for 2 months. "Lavinia, I have not been stationary in 6 years. I have not wanted to be. But I want to be now. And I want it because of you and because of this place, and because of what I have seen in you, which is the most uncommon kind of courage I have ever encountered in another person." He paused. "I am asking if you will marry me, not because you need someone to fight for you. You are perfectly capable of fighting for yourself, and you have proven it beyond any doubt, but because I want to stand beside you, because that is where I want to be." Lavinia looked at him for a long, steady moment, long enough that she could see the nerves in his eyes despite everything, and then she said, "Yes, Noah." He exhaled, a quiet sound, and then the smile came over his whole face the way it had that first morning when she had said we won instead of you won, and she thought that smile was going to be one of the things she looked for the rest of her life. He reached up and touched her face gently, and she leaned into it, and he kissed her in the warm evening light with the west pasture going gold behind them, and it was a good kiss, unhurried and certain, with the particular quality of things that have been honestly arrived at. They were married in July in Redemption, at the small white church on 3rd Street that she had occasionally attended on Sundays, and that the minister, a young man named Reverend Abner Cole who took his work seriously and was good at it, presided over with the straightforward warmth that characterized everything he did. Esperanza stood beside Lavinia, which was fitting and right, and Clem stood beside Noah, wearing his good coat and a clean hat and managing to look simultaneously uncomfortable and deeply pleased. Jefferson Pike came, which made Lavinia's throat tighten, and several of the ranchers who had been watching her case came, and the 2 women from town, and Esperanza's sons, who sat in the front row with the solemn attentiveness of young men who understood they were witnessing something significant. Harlan Briggs was not present, which surprised no one. The investigation into the second document had proceeded slowly but steadily through the spring, and 2 months before the wedding, he had sold the First Territorial Bank to a group of investors from Dallas and quietly removed himself from active business in Calhoun County. It was not justice, exactly, but it was the end of him in the valley, which was something. Lavinia wore a cream-colored dress that Esperanza had helped her make, new fabric ordered from the dry goods store, and her hair was down in a way she almost never wore it, loose around her shoulders, because Noah had told her once that he liked it that way, and she had stored that information for exactly this purpose. She walked down the aisle of the small church toward him, and he was watching her with an expression that made everything else in the room go slightly out of focus, warm and certain, and lit from within with something that she recognized, because she felt it too. When Reverend Cole asked if she took Noah Hunter as her husband, she said, "I do," with the same clear directness she brought to everything, and when he asked Noah, Noah said it with a steadiness that made it sound like the most decided thing he had ever said in his life. They signed the marriage register with the same pen, her name and his name on the same page, Lavinia Kendrick Hunter, and she held his hand as they walked back up the aisle and out into the July afternoon, where the sun was full and white, and the whole town smelled of summer grass, and the sky was the enormous blue that Texas kept for its best days. There was a supper at Esperanza's house that evening, tables brought outside onto the flat ground between the 2 properties, lit with lanterns strung between the fence posts, and there was food enough for twice the people there, and the kind of conversation that goes long and easy into the night, because no one is in a hurry to leave it. At some point in the middle of the evening, Clem raised a glass and said, in his characteristic way without preamble, "She fought that bank alone for 2 years. She didn't need anyone." He paused and looked at Noah. "But I'm glad she's got someone now." Noah looked at Lavinia and she looked back at him, and around them the lanterns swayed in the warm night air. "So am I," Noah said. "So am I," Lavinia said. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, which had always been her home and was now theirs, and in the morning they sat on the porch with coffee in the early blue light, the way she had begun to do alone after Thomas died and now did with him, and the land stretched out in front of them in its wide, quiet way, and Noah's arm was around her shoulders and she was leaning into it, and there was nothing to fight today, nothing to argue, nothing to survive. There was just the land and the light and the morning and each other. The autumn brought changes, as autumns do. Noah began his work with the San Antonio practice, which required him to be in the city several days a week, riding the distance between Redemption and San Antonio on the bay horse that knew the road well by October. Lavinia managed the ranch in his absences with the same capability she had always brought to it, and when he came home in the evenings, or came back after 2 or 3 days away, the ranch felt different to her in a way she could not entirely articulate, fuller perhaps, the way a house feels different when it contains more than one life. They hired a second hand, a young Mexican man named Luis who was Esperanza's cousin and who had grown up working cattle and knew what he was doing. And between Luis and Clem, the ranch ran with a steadiness that allowed Lavinia to think further ahead than she had been able to think for 2 years, past the next payment, past the next season, into the 20-year vision that Thomas had held and that she had inherited and that she was beginning, quietly and without announcement, to make her own. She expanded the cattle herd in the autumn with a careful purchase of 8 good cows from a rancher in the next county who was reducing his operation, and she planted a kitchen garden in the cleared ground south of the house that she had been meaning to plant for years, and she finished the interior of the barn's north section with whitewash that made the whole space brighter in the winter mornings. Noah's work at the San Antonio practice was going well. In the first 3 months, he had taken on 4 cases, all of them involving land disputes with corporate interests, mining claims and railroad easements, and 1 case that involved a German immigrant family whose property had been claimed by a county official through paperwork that was fraudulent in a way that was unfortunately familiar. He told her about the cases in the evenings at the kitchen table, and she listened and asked questions and occasionally said something that reframed his approach in ways that she could tell surprised him, and he told her she should have been a lawyer. "I did not have the opportunity," she said. He looked at her seriously. "If you wanted to study, there are ways. It is harder for women, considerably harder, but it is not impossible." She thought about that. It was not something she had ever considered, not precisely, but she found the idea lodged itself with a permanence that told her it was not going away. She filed it in the same drawer as other things she intended to come back to. That winter was mild by Texas standards, which meant the cattle came through it well, and the new herd additions settled without trouble. Noah was home more in the winter months as the San Antonio work slowed, and they were in the habit by now, the particular domestic rhythm of 2 people who have found that they are genuinely good at living alongside each other. He cooked better than she had expected, which was an early discovery that had made her laugh, and she was worse at sitting still in the evenings than he was, which made him laugh, and they played chess in the evenings with a set he had brought back from San Antonio in November, and the games were long and competitive and a significant indicator of their respective personalities. In February of 1884, Lavinia told Noah she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, sitting across the table from him with her coffee, and she said it directly the way she said everything, and watched his face. He was very still for a moment, and then the expression that came over him was not the smile exactly, but something deeper than the smile, something that she had not seen on his face before, a kind of wonder that softened all the controlled, measured lines of it into something entirely unguarded. He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, "Lavinia," in a voice that was quieter than she had ever heard it. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. "Yes," she said. "Are you all right? Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very healthy, and Dr. Alderman in town says everything looks entirely normal, and I intend to be working this ranch until the week before the baby comes." He laughed, a sound that she felt in her chest, and said, "Of course you do. I told you because I wanted you to know, not because I need to be managed." "I know that," he said, still laughing a little. "I know that very well." He leaned down and kissed her forehead and then her cheek, and then she turned her face up and he kissed her properly. She felt him smile against her lips. They told Clem that afternoon. Clem received the news in his characteristic way, which was to stand very still for a moment and then remove his hat and look at it as though it contained something important, and then replace it and say, "That's good news, Mrs. Hunter. That's very good news." He never entirely stopped calling her Mrs. Kendrick or Mrs. Hunter interchangeably, which she had stopped trying to correct because it seemed to mean something to him that she did not want to diminish. They told Esperanza that evening, riding over to the north property as the sun was going down, and Esperanza made a sound that was half exclamation and half immediate practical planning, and within approximately 4 minutes had a list of things she was going to help with, things she was going to make, things she needed to know from Dr. Alderman, and names she was already considering offering as suggestions. "I appreciate all of this," Noah said gravely. "You should," Esperanza said, pointing at him. "I have 2 sons, and I have helped with 4 other births in this area, and I know more about this than Dr. Alderman." "I believe you completely," Noah said. Lavinia looked at him from across Esperanza's kitchen table, and the love she felt in that moment was a specific, articulate present-tense thing, not the generalized warmth of affection, but the particular clarity of knowing exactly who this person was and finding them exactly right. She had thought, in the months after Thomas died, that the part of her life that contained that kind of knowing was finished. She had not thought it bitterly, or even with great grief, because she was not by nature a person who spent long in bitterness. She had simply thought it factually, the way you think about a door that has closed. She had been wrong, which was, she thought, one of the better mistakes she had made. The spring of 1884 was a good one. The cattle were healthy, the pastures recovered well from the mild winter, and the kitchen garden that Lavinia had planted came up with more enthusiasm than she had anticipated, filling the south side of the house with the green smell of growing things. Noah's San Antonio practice continued to do well, and he brought home at the end of April the news that the German immigrant family's case had been won, the property restored, and the county official who had perpetrated the fraud had been removed from his position. They celebrated with a good bottle of wine that Noah had brought back from San Antonio, and Lavinia drank 1 glass of carefully, which he insisted on despite her protests that she was not made of glass, and they sat on the porch in the warm spring evening, and she thought that this was exactly the kind of evening Thomas had imagined for this land, not the specific details of it, not exactly this man beside her, but this quality of ease and abundance and rightness. She said this to Noah, and he did not look troubled by the mention of Thomas because he never had been, which was one of the things she loved about him. He said, "I think he would be glad of it." "Yes," she said, "I think so too." The baby came in September of 1884, on a Tuesday morning when the early autumn light was the golden color that preceded the shift to the deeper tones of fall. And he was a boy, with Noah's dark hair and Lavinia's dark eyes. And the delivery was hard but uncomplicated, and Dr. Alderman said afterward that he had rarely attended a birth where the mother had been quite so matter-of-fact about the whole enterprise. Esperanza, who had been in the house for the last 4 hours and had been considerably more useful than Dr. Alderman, in Lavinia's opinion, brought the baby to Lavinia after he was cleaned and wrapped, and Lavinia held him with the specific attentiveness of someone cataloging a thing they want to remember exactly. And then Noah sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby into his arms and watched his face. He held the baby with a care that was different from the careful control of everything else he did, less disciplined and more pure, and the expression on his face was the same unguarded wonder she had seen the morning she told him, but deeper now, irrevocable. "Thomas," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. She had not said anything about names, not specifically, because she had not wanted to lead him there. But she had thought it in the private space of her own mind, and here he was, having arrived at it himself. "Yes," she said. "Thomas Noah Hunter," he said. "Yes," she said again, and her voice was not entirely steady, but her eyes were clear and they were both smiling. Clem, when he was told, took his hat off and held it against his chest for a long time. Life on the ranch settled into the rhythm of itself over the next years, a rhythm that had the quality of things that are right in their bones, not easy always, Nothing worth having is ever simply easy, but sound, built on ground that held. Thomas Noah Hunter was a serious, bright-eyed child who was, within 2 years of his arrival, following Clem around the ranch with the determined concentration of someone conducting an extended research project. Clem, who had no children and had never spoken of wanting any, took to the boy with a grave, unsentimental devotion that manifested primarily in teaching him things. By the time young Thomas was 4, he knew the names of every tool in the barn, and which cattle were which, and what the sky meant when it looked a certain way in the morning. Noah built up the San Antonio practice steadily through those years, taking cases that mattered, winning most of them, losing some in ways that he carried home and sat with at the kitchen table, and talked through with Lavinia, who had developed, through years of paying close attention, a legal mind that he genuinely consulted rather than simply shared things with for the sake of sharing. She had begun corresponding with a law professor in Austin, who had written a paper on land rights that had been published in a legal journal, and the correspondence had grown into something substantive that the professor had eventually suggested might be formalized. Noah had come home from San Antonio one Thursday evening in the autumn of 1886, when Thomas was 2 and Lavinia was beginning to be aware of the particular signs of a second pregnancy, and found her at the kitchen table with a letter from the Austin professor. "He is suggesting I could sit in on courses," she told him, looking up. "Not formally enrolled. That is not possible yet, but auditing with his sponsorship. 2 days a month." Noah sat down across from her and picked up the letter and read it. Then he set it down. "Can you do it?" he asked. "With the ranch and the baby coming, Esperanza would help. Clem is here. Louis is good." She paused. "And you would be here more." "I can arrange that," he said immediately. She looked at him. "You would not feel, Lavinia." He said her name in the tone he used when he wanted her to stop arguing against herself. "You have one of the sharpest legal minds I have encountered in my professional life, and I have encountered a fair number. The fact that you have not had formal training is an injustice that can be partially addressed. I would like to help address it. That is all." She looked at him for a long time, the lamp burning between them the way it had the first night he had told her who he was, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this was what it meant to be known. "All right," she said. The second child was a girl born in the spring of 1887, and they named her Clara, which had been the name of Noah's mother. Clara was born loud and determined, and immediately proceeded to be the personality that Thomas Noah was not, which was to say considerably less given to research and considerably more given to strong opinions stated at high volume. Clem's expression when presented with Clara for the first time had a quality of respectful wariness that Lavinia found deeply funny. "She has something to say," Clem observed. "She certainly does," Noah agreed. The ranch had grown by 1887, the herd expanded to nearly 100 cattle, the barn completed and the hay production sufficient. They had hired a third hand, a quiet young man from Tennessee named James, who had the patience for detail work that Clem's back no longer permitted him. The kitchen garden was a proper kitchen garden now, and the house had a new room added to the east side, built the previous summer with Noah's hands and Clem's direction and Louis's carpentry skill, which made the house large enough for the family it had become. The legal work that Lavinia had begun auditing in Austin had, by 1887, evolved into something that the professor described in a letter to Noah as the most thorough, self-directed legal education he had encountered in an adult student. She could not be formally admitted to the bar, not in Texas, not yet, and she knew that and had not constructed her expectations around what the system was not yet prepared to offer. But she had become, through those years of correspondence and study and the practical education of fighting her own case, a genuine resource for the women and men in Calhoun County who found themselves in the kind of land dispute that had once been only hers. She charged very little, sometimes nothing. She told Noah she was not running a practice. She was simply being useful, and he told her that being useful was another word for practicing law, and she told him to mind his own business. Jefferson Pike died in the spring of 1888, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 79. Lavinia and Noah attended the small funeral with Clem and Esperanza, and afterward Lavinia stood at the grave for a while by herself, thinking about the old man who had talked to a stranger about a widow's case in the cold January of 1883, because it was the right thing to do and he had not known any other way to be. She said, to the grave, quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Pike." Noah was beside her when she turned, having come without announcing himself, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked back through the cemetery in the spring afternoon, and she thought that this was what life was made of. Not only the grand things but the small ones too, the old men who talked to strangers, the neighbors who stood beside you. The men who arrived at courthouse steps on cold March mornings, with leather satchels and document examiners' reports, and the particular kind of integrity that was not performed but simply lived. Clem's health began to decline in the summer of 1888, which was not unexpected given that he was 67 and his back had been bad for years, but the rate of it was faster than they had anticipated. He did not stop working, because stopping was something he appeared constitutionally incapable of, but he worked less, and in the evenings he sat on the bunkhouse porch rather than in it, which he said was because he liked the air but which everyone understood was because he needed to be where he could see the land. Lavinia moved him out of the bunkhouse and into the new east room of the house in September, which he objected to strenuously on the grounds that he was a ranch hand and not a family member, and she told him flatly that he had been a family member for more than 30 years, and if he wanted to argue about it, they could both find better uses for their time. He moved into the east room. He died on a Tuesday in November of 1888, in the early morning, before the household was up, and Lavinia found him when she came to bring his breakfast, sitting in his chair by the window with his hands in his lap, and his face turned toward the view of the east pasture, which was the view he had requested when they had set the room up. She sat with him for a while before she called anyone in the early light, and told him all the things she had not always said directly but had meant every day, that he had been the most reliable person she had ever known, that the ranch would not have survived without him, that Thomas had been lucky to have him, and she had been lucky to inherit that luck. She told him Noah had been good for her. She told him the children were going to grow up on this land the way they should. Then she went and told Noah, and Noah held her for a long time without saying anything, which was what she needed. The funeral was on a Thursday. They buried Clem at the corner of the ranch's east pasture, which was what he had said he wanted, and they put a good stone marker there with his name and the dates, and beneath the dates, because Lavinia could not think of anything more true, the words, "He stayed." Christmas of 1888 was quiet but not sad. Thomas Noah was 4, and Clara was 1.5, and they were sufficient together to fill any room they occupied with the specific energy of children who are healthy and loved and aware of being both. Noah's parents, his mother Clara, for whom the baby was named, and his father, who had recovered from the loss of Wyoming enough to have built a decent life in Colorado, came for the Christmas week, and the house was full in the way that houses are when the generations overlap and the past and present sit at the same table. Noah's father, James Hunter, sat with Lavinia on the porch the second evening and looked out at the land and said, "He told me about the hearing. March of 1883. He wrote me a letter." Lavinia looked at him. James Hunter was 63, with Noah's build and a version of Noah's face that time and difficulty had made more angular, and his eyes were the same sage green as his son's. "He said he had found something in Texas worth staying for," James Hunter said. "That was the letter, just that. I knew him well enough to understand what it meant." Lavinia was quiet for a moment. "Did he tell you about the case?" "He told me everything about the case," James Hunter said. He told me about the original loan note and the forged document and the document examiner and the hearing. He paused, but mostly he told me about you. She looked at the east pasture in the last light of the December afternoon. The stone marker was just visible at the corner of the field. I am glad he did, she said. In the spring of 1889, a young woman named Rose Hadley came to Lavinia's kitchen door on a Wednesday morning with a land dispute document and the name of a man in Fort Worth who was claiming an easement across her late husband's property that did not exist in any record Rose had ever seen. She had been given Lavinia's name by a woman in town who said, "If you need someone to look at a document and tell you the truth of it, you go to Lavinia Hunter." Lavinia made her coffee and sat across the table from her and looked at the document. It took her about 20 minutes to identify the misrepresentation in it, a selective quotation of an 1874 territorial surveying ordinance that, read in its full context, did not say what the Fort Worth man's lawyer was claiming it said. She wrote Rose a letter explaining it, in plain language, with the full text of the ordinance and the citation, and told her to send it to the county land registrar and the Fort Worth man's lawyer simultaneously, and to write to Lavinia again if anything further developed. Rose left with the letter and the expression of someone who had arrived desperate and was leaving with a reason for something different. Lavinia stood at the kitchen door and watched her ride away, and then she went back to the table and sat down with her own coffee, and thought about Jefferson Pike talking to a stranger at the livery in the cold of January 1883, and about the document examiner in Austin, and about Noah arriving at the courthouse steps with his leather satchel and the particular certainty in his voice that she had recognized immediately as the sound of someone who did not say things they did not mean. She thought about the morning she had looked at herself in the oval mirror above the wash basin and said out loud that she was going to walk in and win. She had been right. She had won. And then, somewhat to her own surprise, she had been given considerably more than she had been fighting for. Noah came home that evening from 2 days in San Antonio and found her in the kitchen at the table with papers spread in front of her. He had developed the habit, over the years, of reading the state of her focus before he interrupted it, and he came in quietly and set down his satchel and made himself coffee and sat across from her, without disturbing whatever she was working on. After a few minutes she looked up. "Rose Hadley came today," she said. "I heard. I passed her on the road coming in." He paused. "Easement dispute. Spurious one. I think she will be all right." He looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm between them the way it always was, and the house around them was the house they had made together, the children asleep in their rooms, the east room quiet now, the barn finished and the herd sound and the land settled. "You are becoming the person in this county that people come to," he said. "You understand that." "I am being useful," she said, "as we discussed." He smiled, and she smiled back, and they sat in the warm kitchen in the spring evening with the papers between them and the coffee, and the particular ease of two people who have chosen each other with open eyes, and found the choice confirmed by everything the years have brought. She picked up her pen and went back to her papers, and he opened his satchel and went back to his, and outside the window the Texas night was the deep, particular dark of a landscape that goes on past the edge of sight, full of weather and stars and the slow turning of seasons, and the land that had been Thomas Kendrick's dream and her fight and their life together sat quietly in the dark, as it always had, as it would long after, holding everything that had happened on it and everything that was still to come. In the summer of 1890, the county held a public meeting about the conditions at the land registry, a meeting that had been building for several years as more and more irregularities came to light, not all of them connected to Briggs, who was long gone, but systemic enough to require addressing. Lavinia was asked to speak at it, the third speaker after the county registrar and a rancher named Grover Dale who had his own dispute. She had not expected to be asked, and she stood up in the Redemption Town Hall with 200 people in front of her and said what she knew, which was considerable, and said it the way she said everything, clearly and without apology. Afterward, a woman she had never met, a widow from the South County named Frances Burns, found her outside and said, "I have been in a dispute with the county assessor's office for 3 years. I have not known what to do." Lavinia looked at her. Frances Burns was perhaps 50, with a worn, capable face and the eyes of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Come to my kitchen," Lavinia said. "On Thursday. Bring everything you have." Frances came on Thursday, and then she came the following Thursday, and by August there were 4 women sitting around Lavinia's kitchen table with documents and coffee, and Lavinia was looking at all of it. And Noah, who had come home midway through the second Thursday to find his kitchen occupied, had looked at the scene for approximately 30 seconds and then quietly relocated to the porch to review his own work without comment, because he understood exactly what he was looking at. That evening after the women had gone, he said, "You know this is a practice." "It is a Thursday gathering," she said firmly. "On 4 consecutive Thursdays," he said, "with clients." "They are neighbors," she said. He looked at her with the expression he used when she was being obstinate about something she was not actually going to be obstinate about for long, patient and amused and entirely certain of her. "Fine," she said. "It might be a practice." "A very good one," he said. It was. Over the following years it became a known thing in Calhoun County, and then in the adjacent counties. The woman in the house by the east pasture who understood land documents and could explain them in plain language, and charged what you could manage and sometimes nothing, and who had fought the First Territorial Bank alone for 2 years before winning, and who, if you needed someone who understood what it was to stand on the wrong side of power and keep standing, was exactly the person to find. Young Thomas Noah Hunter grew up watching his parents work at the kitchen table together, reading documents across from each other with coffee going cold between them, and he grew up with the land under his feet and Clem's stone marker at the corner of the east pasture, and the particular understanding that the ground you stood on was worth fighting for. He was a serious, thoughtful boy who became a serious, thoughtful young man with his mother's clear eyes and his father's steady way. Clara grew up loud and capable and interested in approximately everything, and she grew up watching her mother's Thursday kitchen and drew from it conclusions about what women could do that she carried forward into her own life with a directness that occasionally startled people and never startled her parents. Noah argued cases in San Antonio and wrote articles for legal journals about land rights in the territories, and came home to redemption with the reliable consistency of a man who has found the thing he intends to come home to for the rest of his life. He was 45 when Thomas was 10, 50 when Clara was 14, and the years sat on him with the particular quality of a good life lived honestly. The lines of his face deepened, and his hair more gray than dark, but the sage-green eyes exactly the same as they had been on a cold March morning outside a limestone courthouse in 1883. Lavinia was 43 when Clara was in school, and Thomas was apprenticing himself to the land with the seriousness of purpose that would eventually make him the best cattleman in the county, and she was working at her kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon when she stopped and looked up from the papers and out through the window at the east pasture, which was golden in the October light, and felt the full weight and the full grace of everything that had happened in that pasture's long view. The lean years, the fight, the hearing where she had walked in wearing her black dress and her polished boots, and her absolute unwillingness to be beaten. The man who had appeared at the courthouse steps with a leather satchel and a document examiner's report, and had said simply that she was not alone anymore. She was not alone. She had not been alone since that morning, and the not aloneness was a different thing from anything she had expected it to be. Not a rescue and not a softening, but a partnership. A daily honest choosing of someone who chose her back. A man who had heard about her fight at a livery stable and had decided without hesitation that it was worth taking up. She heard his horse in the yard, the familiar sound of it, the bay horse older now but still strong, and she set down her pen and went to the door. He was swinging down from the saddle when she came out onto the porch, and he looked up and saw her and smiled. And it was the same smile it had always been, the one that came over his whole face, and she went down the steps and across the yard to him. He caught her when she reached him, his arms around her, solid and certain, smelling of dust and October air, and she held on. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said against the top of her head. The Morrison case settled, full property restoration. "That is wonderful," she said. "There was a letter at the San Antonio office," he said, pulling back to look at her, "from the Austin professor. He says the legislation he has been lobbying for may go to a committee vote in the next legislative session. The provision about women's capacity to hold legal standing in property cases." She looked at him. "Truly. He thinks it has a genuine chance," Noah said. "He cited your Thursday practice in his brief as evidence of de facto capacity already being exercised." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about what that would mean. For the women who came to her kitchen table, and the women who would come after them, and the cases that could be argued directly rather than through the indirect channels she had learned to navigate. "Then we had better make sure the Thursday practice is impeccable," she said. "When is it not?" he said. She looked at him. 47 years old, gray in his hair, the sage-green eyes on her in the afternoon light the way they had been since that first morning, clear and direct and full of the particular regard that she had learned over the years to receive without deflection. "Come inside," she said. "Clara will be home from school, and I have made a good stew, and you look like you have been on a horse for 6 hours. 5.5, he said. "Come inside, Noah," she said. He came inside, and the door of the ranch house closed behind them both, and the east pasture lay in the last of the October light, wide and golden and quiet, the stone at the corner catching the sun. And above it the Texas sky went on, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, as it had always been, as it would always be, over a land that had been fought for and kept and lived on and loved by the people who had decided, each in their own way, that it was worth the standing.